First of all, we need to understand what the system was that Srila Prabhupada authorized via the July 9th, 1977 Rtvik Acharya appointment letter. With this letter or document, Srila Prabhupada had set up an initiation by proxy system. That is, Srila Prabhupada had delegated all the physical or mundane aspects of the initiation process to his various disciples, such that Srila Prabhupada was no longer physically involved in the process at all. I'll explain more about this shortly, but for now, that is the basic concept of what the system he set up accomplished. And the GBC accept that the system he had set up was bona fide, but only while Srila Prabhupada was present in this world. What the GBC and Jayadvaita object to is they claim that once the spiritual master departs, then that system becomes invalid. I'll also get back to this point later on when presenting a different argument. Those opposing the ongoing Rtvik representative system argue that this initiation by proxy after the Guru has departed is something no past Acharya had ever done before. With some exceptions, in general, I agree with that. But it is also extremely important to understand and keep in mind that in the exact same way, no past Acharya had even set up such a 100% proxy system of accepting new disciples, even when that Guru remained living in this world. The system that Srila Prabhupada authorized via the Rtvik representative appointment document, or the July 9th letter, was so unique and so radical that yes, it is a fact that no past Acharya had ever set up such a full and complete proxy system for accepting new disciples, either after they had departed or even while they were still present in this world. And that is a very important point to keep in mind. Yet Srila Prabhupada did do just that. And the GBC, in fact, accept that this radical system, which no past Acharya had ever established before, which had no past precedents, is, or in their view, was bona fide. But they say only while Srila Prabhupada was present. My point is that even while Srila Prabhupada was present, that system that he authorized was solely unique and radical. It was a process that no past Acharya had ever established previously, even while they were present in this world. Such a system was unprecedented. The best way to explain the system is to illustrate it. First, this is the typical traditional process for initiation. One, the Guru makes an assessment of the candidate disciple. The Guru wants to assure that the student is sincere and is ready to submit him or herself to the Guru and is ready to follow the Guru's instructions and is receptive to the Guru's teachings and guidance. Two, the student also must make an assessment of the Guru. Is the Guru bona fide? Is he fully enlightened? And is he a fully realized soul who knows the absolute truth and who can impart the ultimate knowledge to him? Is this spiritual master fully capable of leading me out of this material world, out of the samsara, the cycle of birth and death? Three, Guru formally accepts the student as his disciple and performs the Agnihotra, or the fire yagna, the fire sacrifice. Four, in the case of first or Harinam initiation, the Guru gives the new disciple his or her spiritual name and chants on his or her japa beads. In the case of second or Brahman initiation, the Guru chants on the sacred thread and gives the thread to the new disciple, for the male disciple only, and also chants the Gayatri mantra in the ear of the disciple. Hare Krishna, this is an insert. Actually, I missed this part. While the other was the traditional system, what the chart is up on the screen right now is the system that Srila Prabhupada established in ISKCON for most of the time that he was here, at least from the late 1960s. If you will notice that he started delegating aspects, such as delegating to the temple presidents that it was for them now to assess the new prospective disciples. So that because Srila Prabhupada was traveling most of the time, he didn't stay at a temple long enough to make that assessment himself personally. So he delegated that to the temple presidents. And then after he established the GBC in 1970, he began to delegate other aspects, such as chanting on the beads, not on every initiation, but from time to time with different GBC. He would have them chant on the beads and sometimes select the spiritual names. Of course, others performed the fire yagnas when he wasn't even there. He made a audio tape of himself chanting Gayatri mantra that can be played in the ear when he is not present. And he even instructed that if the tape isn't found or they don't need the tape, they can chant in the ear and on his behalf. So these were all quite radical, actually, and unprecedented for a guru, for a spiritual master in our sampradaya, to delegate even some of these, what to speak of all of these different aspects. But this was the system that Srila Prabhupada had established in ISKCON for most of the time while he was here, at least from the late 1960s to 1977 at his departure, or in July of 1977, he formalized the system and took it one step further. So that will be the next chart. And on this side, this is the system of initiation by proxy, or the Rtvik representative system that Srila Prabhupada had authorized via the July 9th letter. Number one, Srila Prabhupada had long before delegated the process of assessment of the new student to the temple president. Srila Prabhupada had established the following criteria that a new student needed to follow for a minimum of 6 months for the first initiation, and for another year after that for the second initiation. Following the four regulative principles: no illicit sex, no gambling, no meat eating, and no intoxication. B, chant a minimum of 16 rounds per day. C, attend morning and evening programs, Rtviks, and classes as much as possible. D, engage in devotional service. The temple president would make the assessment on behalf of Srila Prabhupada that the student had met those criteria for the given time. Then the temple president would write a letter of recommendation and send it not to Srila Prabhupada, but to the nearest Rtvik representative, and who would recommend that student be given first or second initiation. 2, the student would make his assessment of Srila Prabhupada, whether he's the actual bona fide guru, via the study of his books, listening to his lectures, and learning of his teachings from the temple president, sannyasis, GBCs, senior devotees, and other members. 3, on receiving the letter of recommendation from the temple president, the Rtvik representative will notify the temple president that the student has been accepted as Srila Prabhupada's disciple. Number 4, the Rtvik representative would give the spiritual name and chant on the beads for the first initiates, and chant on the thread for the second initiates. As far as the Gayatri mantra, Srila Prabhupada had made a recording of himself chanting the Gayatri that was to be played via headphone into the ear of the Brahmin initiate. Or he had also authorized GBC members could also chant the mantra in the ear if the recording was not available. The temple president or the Rtvik would perform the fire yagna. The new member would then become a direct initiated disciple of His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Note that in the Ritvik's representative process, Srila Prabhupada was no longer physically involved at all, period, in that process. He wasn't even physically informed when the initiations took place. He wasn't given a list of the prospective new disciples. He was neither consulted about the initiations or even informed about them. Via the authorization by this July 9th Rtvik Acharya document, the entire process was now to be handled by the temple presidents and the nearest Rtvik representative, who were also members of the GBC. With this process, Srila Prabhupada may be lying on his bed in Vrindavan, so weak he can hardly speak, while accepting new disciples who are being initiated on his behalf as his direct disciples all over the world. Disciples who may have never seen Srila Prabhupada, nor he them, who had never been in his physical presence. Srila Prabhupada no longer needed to be physically present. He no longer needed to be physically involved in any of the physical and mundane aspects of the initiation process, period. Via this Rtvik representative system of initiation. He no longer had to accept the recommendations. He no longer performed the fire yajna. He no longer gave the spiritual names. He no longer chanted on the beads or the threads. He no longer himself personally chanted the Gayatri mantra in the ear of the disciple. The entire physical process of the spiritual initiation he had delegated to others to perform on his behalf. Yet those new initiates would become his direct disciples. Again, it is very important to note and understand that no past acharya, as far as we know, has ever set up or authorized such a complete and organized proxy system of initiation like this, where they could accept disciples via system by which they were no longer physically involved in it at all. The system Srila Prabhupada authorized was actually very radical. That is a fact. Yet even though that system was a major departure from what any other past acharya had ever done, even though it was such a radical system, it is important to take note that Srila Prabhupada never gave any long, detailed explanation as to how and why this unprecedented, unique, and radical system was bona fide. He never explained his actions. He didn't sit down with all his GBC and leading senior disciples and explain month after month why and how this system was bona fide and valid. Jayadvaita's argument was that the ongoing process of initiation via this same proxy system of representatives was something that is so radical that it would have warranted Srila Prabhupada would have had to have explained for months and months to all the GBC and the senior members. But the fact is that this process of proxy initiation via the Rtvik representatives is just as unprecedented and just as unique and radical, even while Srila Prabhupada was present. And yet Srila Prabhupada didn't give any sort of an explanation, even a short explanation, I should say, of what he had set up and why it was bona fide. He obviously didn't feel it was necessary to explain his actions, to justify what he was doing, or explain how what he was doing was authorized. He simply set up the system, authorized it, and instructed us to implement it. That was all. He is the authorized and empowered Shaktivesh avatar, representative of Lord Sri Krishna, because he has authorized it. It is authorized. That's all. Once he authorized this, no additional justification or explanation was needed. Only a true empowered Shaktivesh avatar, only a true bona fide representative of Krishna can do that. And Srila Prabhupada did it. That's all. Either we accept Srila Prabhupada as authorized, that he is authorized to authorize such a system, or we reject him and foolishly argue that he is not empowered by Krishna and that he is not authorized by Krishna and that he cannot authorize such a radical system. Again, keep in mind that this system was radical even while Srila Prabhupada was still present with us. It is obvious where I stand. There is no doubt, no question. Srila Prabhupada is Krishna's pure, empowered representative. And what he set up is fully authorized by Krishna and is fully bona fide, even though no past acharya had ever done such a thing before. Now let's take a closer look at the timeline for the system that His Divine Grace authorized. Actually, the Rtvik representative of the Acharya system was not implemented all at once with the July 9th letter. Rather, the process had been gradually introduced over a span of 9 to 10 years. In the early days of ISKCON, Srila Prabhupada performed all of the aspects of the traditional process of initiation. He did this entirely on his own. He assessed the new members if they were sincere and fit to be given initiation. He made his own recommendations and made the decisions himself to accept the new members as his disciple. He performed the fire yagna himself. He came up with the spiritual names. He chanted on the beads of the threads, and he chanted the Gayatri mantra directly in the ear of the disciple. That is how the early members of ISKCON were initiated. But as more centers were opened and Srila Prabhupada began traveling more and more, he wasn't at any one temple long enough to personally verify whether a new member was meeting his requirements to become his initiated disciple. Therefore, he began authorizing the temple presidents to perform this function on his behalf. I don't know exactly when this was started, but I am quite certain Srila Prabhupada started this in some form or the other by the late 1960s. I had mentioned that there was a recording of Srila Prabhupada chanting the Gayatri mantra. Srila Prabhupada had specifically recorded it for the sole purpose that it can be played in the ear of the new Brahmin initiate when their initiation ceremony was conducted by one of his disciples on his behalf when he wasn't present at that temple, such as when he was traveling. And I say also for after he departs. I myself received Gayatri Mantra as second initiation in July of 1975. Srila Prabhupada was going to be coming to the San Francisco Rathayatra before he would come to the LA temple where I was living. And so it was planned that he would hold initiations in San Francisco. But some of the senior devotees felt that there were just too many devotees up for first and second initiation to all be initiated at one time. So it was decided that some of us would be given initiation before he arrived. In Los Angeles, Hridayananda performed the fire yagna, and about seven of us were given either first or second initiation. After the fire yagna, Tulsi Das, our temple president, took me upstairs to Srila Prabhupada's room where a tape recorder was, and he had me put on headphones and he played the recording of Srila Prabhupada chanting the Gayatri mantra. That was quite common by 1975. I was actually surprised, however, when I found letters mentioning this tape, this recording, even as early as 1970. Quote, I have already sent one Gayatri tape to London, and it is being kept safely there along with a full set of instructions for performing the ceremony. The mantra is to be heard only by the new initiate through headphones, and once only. So if you find Natabar, Yogeshwar, Indrayani, and Hari Priya properly qualified, you may perform the ceremony duly. End of quote. This is a letter to Krishnadas that was written on the 15th of November, 1970. This letter is very interesting. This was 1970, only 4 years after Srila Prabhupada had officially started ISKCON. Here he is telling Krishnadas that if he finds the forementioned devotees properly qualified, then he can perform their initiation ceremony and play the Gayatri tape in their ear. So here, as early as 1970, Srila Prabhupada had authorized his disciple, Krishnadas, who was one of the original 12 members of the GBC, which Srila Prabhupada had just created in July of that year, 1970, to make the assessment of these disciples. Krishnadas must have only been initiated himself no more than 3 or 4 years at the time, max. ISKCON had only been established for 4 years. And so he was probably initiated less than 3 years. And yet Srila Prabhupada had delegated him to decide if the other new devotees were qualified to be given Brahman initiation or not. And then Srila Prabhupada authorized him to perform their Brahman initiation ceremony. By a few years after this, Srila Prabhupada had even delegated to several of the GBC to chant on the beads and the threads on his behalf and to come up with the names, spiritual names for the first initiates. If you combine all of those functions, then you will have even more than what he authorized the Rtvik representatives to do. The Rtvik representatives were not the ones who assessed the new devotees. That duty Srila Prabhupada had eventually given to the temple presidents. So as early as 1970, Srila Prabhupada had authorized this new GBC member to make the assessment of these 4 specific devotees, then to hold the fire yagna and give them Brahman thread, and use the recording to play in their ear. In a letter to Bhagawan, written on April 11th of 1971, displayed on the screen, Srila Prabhupada tells Bhagawan that he can chant the Gayatri mantra for the new initiates. He tells him that the tape recording of the Gayatri mantra is not required. I'll read from the letter. Yes, the Gayatri mantra initiations may be performed by you. Hold a fire ceremony and give the sacred thread on my behalf. I am enclosing herewith 1 thread duly chanted on by me, along with a copy of the Gayatri mantra for Sri Govinda Das and mantra for his wife, Sri Lekha Devi. Also, to each, you should recite the mantra individually, and they will repeat, and then the thread should be offered to Sri Govinda. The tape recording is not required. This is a letter to Bhagawan on the 11th of April, 1971. Srila Prabhupada wrote to Kurandar, my dear Kurandar, yes, you may perform the ceremony for a second initiation for Tulsidas, Krishnakanti, Lochan Das, Nitai Das, Jayatirtha, Karuna Sindhu, Sarola Devi, and Maitila Devi. The ceremony should be held as usual. Before the ceremony, the chief Brahman chants Gayatri silently. The tape should be played through a set of earphones so that only the initiate hears the mantra. They should hear once only, repeating the mantras word by word with the tape record. Devananda says the instructions are there on Xerox in a file labeled prayers, ceremonies, etc. This file is in the top drawer of the file cabinet in his small office, so you can get it out and follow the instructions given there. Hope this meets you in good health. Your ever well wisher, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Well, doesn't say Prabhupada. Your ever well wisher, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami. Please send the red nickel cadmium battery charging cable for the ear and the earphone also. They must be purchased and sent as soon as possible. And so far as Gayatri initiations are concerned, the tape is not required. You have the threads chanted on by me now, and now I am enclosing here with copies of the Gayatri mantra, 1 for each of the 7 disciples to be initiated, hold a fire ceremony, chant the Gayatri mantra to them individually, and let them hear and repeat. Then offer the threads on my behalf. The fire sacrifice should be performed as usual. From these letters, we can see that hearing Srila Prabhupada chant the Gayatri mantra via the taped recording is nice if it is available, but it isn't required to finalize or complete the Brahman initiation on Srila Prabhupada's behalf. Srila Prabhupada had authorized and delegated this to these selected GBC men who performed the initiation ceremonies on his behalf. At least by 1973, Srila Prabhupada had also authorized at least 1 GBC man that I'm personally aware of to come up with the spiritual names for the first initiate devotees. I was given first initiation in December of 1973 in Los Angeles. Kurandar was the GBC for Los Angeles at the time. Kurandar didn't tell me at the time in 1973, but later in 1975, he told me that for that initiation, my initiation, held on December 10th, 1973, and also for the initiation that was held in Los Angeles before that, Srila Prabhupada had asked Kurandar to come up with the spiritual names for the new devotees. Kurandar told me this in 1975 when we shared an office together while he was overseeing the finances for the Fate Museum project. He told me that he didn't want to tell other devotees. He didn't want other devotees to know that it was he who selected their spiritual names. He thought it might weaken their faith in Srila Prabhupada. Of course, Srila Prabhupada had authorized him to select the names. So whether Srila Prabhupada selected personally or he had authorized someone to do it on his behalf, it's still just as potent and as bona fide. But Kurandar was thinking it might weaken their faith. But he wanted to tell me what happened because he said that I was the only one devotee out of those 2 initiations where Srila Prabhupada didn't accept the name that Karandar came up with. Karandar wanted me to know that Srila Prabhupada had personally selected my name. I'll share more details here in the sidebar, why Srila Prabhupada didn't accept the name that Karandar had selected for me and why Srila Prabhupada selected my name himself. This is based on what Karandar told me in 1975. Karandar would select the names for the first initiates weeks before the initiation. Then when Srila Prabhupada arrived in LA prior to the initiations, Karandar would go to Srila Prabhupada's room and he would take everyone's beads. He put a name, a tag on the beads with our birth name and our new spiritual name that Karandar had come up with. Karandar would take one set of beads, he would read the name that he'd selected, and hand that set of beads to Srila Prabhupada so Srila Prabhupada would chant on them. Then Karandar would take another separate set of beads, he would read the name that he had given on that bead, but then Karandar would chant on that bead. So in this way, they would each be chanting on one set of beads. And they would chant one round on the beads together. In this way, half the devotees, Srila Prabhupada had chanted on their beads, and the other half, Karandar had chanted on their beads. Karandar told me that he had picked up my beads, read off my name, that he had selected, and then handed my beads to Srila Prabhupada. He told me that Srila Prabhupada paused and was looking closely at my beads. And then he told Karandar, no, his name shall be Amaya Atma. Prabhupada pronounced it. We call it Ameyatma. My name is spelled Ameyatma, and everyone else uses the Sanskrit pronunciation and calls me Ameyatma. But Srila Prabhupada has Bengali accent, and he pronounced it as Amyoatma, adding an O in the middle. During my initiation ceremony, this is the way he pronounced it, Amyoatma.
Yes. So your spiritual name is Amiya Atma or Amiyo Atma. The Atma which cannot be measured.
And I say it was a Bengali pronunciation because in 1979, on my first trip to India, I was in Mayapur and I wanted my name carved on kartals that I purchased in Navadvip. And when I told them my name, Amiyatma, the 2 Bengalis couldn't understand. So I wrote it down. And then they saw how it was written. They pronounced it exactly as Srila Prabhupada said, saying, Amyo Atma. So you might be wondering why Srila Prabhupada had paused and was looking at my beads and then rejected the name Karandar had selected for me, which would have been Janardhan Das. And instead told Karandar my name would be Amyo Atma Das, or Amayatma Das. Well, here are my original japa beads. These are the ones that Srila Prabhupada chanted on, and these are the ones that he was looking at. I'm going to do some close-up videos so you'll be able to see what I'm referring to here. He told me that when he handed these beads to Srila Prabhupada, the Prabhupada paused and was looking at them. They were just standard name tree beads, so why was he pausing? What was he looking at so closely? When I restrung my beads, I had tied a little silver jari type earring onto the head bead. I hadn't asked anyone if that was okay to do that or not, but they were on the beads when Srila Prabhupada chanted on them, and Karandar didn't tell me that Srila Prabhupada had made any objections to that. Other devotees, when they saw the earring on my beads, they complained and they chastised me for it, so 2 months after I was initiated, I took it off. That probably caught his attention at first, but well, let me show you. This is visible after all these years. It's now 2020 as I am making this video. And I was initiated in 1973, so that was 47 years ago. 47 years of chanting on these beads. Of course, we don't chant on the head bead. But I had actually written on the head bead, though, so forgive me, Krishna. I had written in the Devangari Sanskrit. Even though I wrote on the head beads, again, Karendra didn't say any that Srila Prabhupada had said anything about it. But it probably wasn't the best thing to do, is to write on the head bead, because the head bead is Krishna. But anyway, I did so, and here's what I wrote. Hare Krishna. Hare Ram. And then sideways, I wrote Jaya Prabhupada, but the head bead. I had written Om Gopi Jana. Just that, Om Gopi Jana. I was a new bhakta when I wrote that, and I wrote it before I was initiated. And I had read the translation to Gopi Jana Vallabha, which means the protector of the gopis, but I didn't know Sanskrit well enough, so I thought that Jana meant protector, and then Gopi, Om Gopi Jana. So I thought Om Gopi Jana meant the protector of the gopis, but actually Jana just means a people. So Om Gopi Jana just addresses the gopis. Vallabha is the word that actually means protector. Anyway, I just had only written Om Gopi Jana, and besides, the bead is very small, and that was all there was room for. I had written these using an ordinary ballpoint ink pen. And after I wrote these words on the bead, I then dipped the bead in some acrylic varnish. Here, I found a bottle of it. Same, except the one I used was probably a gloss varnish. Anyway, that's what I dipped the head bead into. Even though I wrote this with just a regular ballpoint pen, after the beads had soaked in oil even, and then I sealed it with this acrylic varnish, it has lasted over 47 years so far as of this video recording without coming off. The main point here is that by 1973, Srila Prabhupada had even delegated the function of coming up with the spiritual names for the new initiates to some of the GBC men. And recap, no later than 1970, Srila Prabhupada had delegated others to function, the function of assessing the new initiate and performing the fire yagnas on his behalf. He had made a Gayatri recording, which was to use when he wasn't present for the initiation ceremony, but even instructed the GBC men, they can chant the mantra themselves on his behalf. If that recording wasn't available, it wasn't necessary. Also, by 72, 73, Srila Prabhupada had authorized some of the GBC men to be chanting on the beads on his behalf. In 1973, by 1973, I should say, the only thing that Srila Prabhupada still continued to do for every initiation from then up until the July 9th letter was that he made the final decision to accept the recommendation of the temple presidents, who would send their letter of recommendation for the devotees to him, to Srila Prabhupada. I would like to point out something about this. I have not found or heard of any instance of a temple president having sent a letter of recommendation to Srila Prabhupada where Srila Prabhupada ever rejected someone on that list that was being recommended. The letters would usually contain the names of more than one person to be recommended for initiation. And Srila Prabhupada, as far as I've seen, never wrote back saying, I accept such and such as my disciples, but reject your recommendation for this one and that one. No, all of those whom the temple presidents had recommended, Srila Prabhupada always accepted their recommendations. Because of this, it is my personal opinion that I consider the role of the temple presidents of being more important than that of the Rtvik representative's role. Even though the Rtvik representative will receive the letters of recommendation, if they follow Srila Prabhupada's example, they would be accepting those recommendations automatically. So the ones making the most crucial decisions, as far as who qualifies for initiation, would be the temple presidents. The Rtvik really doesn't decide, but just formally acts on Srila Prabhupada's behalf to accept those recommendations. Well, I couldn't find it while I was writing this part of the script. I do recall a long time ago, I think it was on a tape I heard, it could have been from the database, where Srila Prabhupada was chastising one temple president because he had recommended some people for initiation who left right after they were initiated. And Srila Prabhupada reminded that temple president of the seriousness of their giving the recommendations. And I recall Srila Prabhupada said that the temple president will share in the karma if they recommend someone who is not actually fit. As I said, I remember that, but I unfortunately couldn't find it in the database as I'm doing this presentation. There is a letter on the screen if you want to read it, but this is not the letter or the reference that I was referring to, as it doesn't explain the temple president having to accept part of the karma. And while we're discussing this, there is another letter on the screen below where Srila Prabhupada rejects the idea of the GBC having to give their approval for recommendations. Srila Prabhupada says that the temple presidents need to make the recommendations because they're in the position to make the first-hand observations. And you can read these at your leisure. Okay, well, we got a bit off tangent again, so let's get back to my story. One main argument that Jayadvaita Swami gave, opposing the idea that Srila Prabhupada wanted us to continue with the Rtvik Ras idea, was that he says that this idea of Srila Prabhupada remaining guru, continuing to give initiation, even after he has physically departed this world, represents such a major change or new development, because it's something we have no record of any past acharya ever doing this, that he says that Srila Prabhupada would have needed to have spoken for months and months about it in detail. And since Srila Prabhupada hadn't given such detailed explanations, Jayadvaita Maharaj claims that we must reject this idea that Srila Prabhupada actually wanted us to continue with the Rtvik representative path. The point I was making here is that from the very early days, Srila Prabhupada began delegating various aspects of the initiation process, which forms the basis of this Rtvik representative system. He had delegated to both temple presidents, and then once he had formed the GBC, he delegated more and more of the physical aspects of the initiation process to the various GBC men. Yet in all of those instances where he authorizes various members, he gave no long explanations as to how and why it was bona fide for him to delegate these aspects of the initiation. As we see in the letters on the screen. For example, in 1970, when he authorized Krishnadas to make his own assessment of the 4 devotees up for Brahman initiation, and then if he, Krishnadas, decides that they are qualified, then Krishnadas can then perform their initiation ceremony and initiate them on Srila Prabhupada's behalf. Or in the letter to Bhagawan and other similar letters, Srila Prabhupada simply told you what to do and how to do it. Such as the letter to Bhagawan, he wrote, "Hold a fire ceremony and give the sacred thread on my behalf." But Srila Prabhupada had not, and all of these instances that I have found ever gave any sort of explanation, even a short one, as to how and why what he was doing by delegating such functions regarding the initiations was scripturally sound and authorized. He simply instructed, you do this, and that was all. No long or even short explanation or justification. Just do this. Hold a fire ceremony, give the second thread on my behalf. The second thread. He simply instructed them, you do this. That was all. No long or even short explanation or justification. Just do this. Hold a fire ceremony and give the sacred thread on my behalf. Sometime back, probably around 1999 or 2000 or so, several devotees and myself engaged in an email debate on this Rtvik issue, and one Prabhupada disciple wrote a long essay why it was bogus for anyone other than the spiritual master to make the assessment of the new initiate. He then ranted on how only the guru must chant the Brahman thread, and only the guru must chant the Gayatri mantra in the ear of the Brahman for the Brahman initiation, or that Brahman initiation will not be valid. He quoted from various scriptures to support his claims and was adamant that without the guru directly performing these functions, such initiations would be invalid. He wrote all of this because I or someone in the conference mentioned that during the Rtvik representative initiation, the Rtvik priest will chant on the thread, and that the new Brahmin will hear the Gayatri chanted by Srila Prabhupada from a recording, or the GBC could chant in the ear. So this devotee wrote this long article stating how all of that was so bogus, just bogus, bogus. And he went on at how such initiations would have to be declared totally invalid. In response, I then wrote and asked him if he believed that Srila Prabhupada was a bogus guru. And I asked if he thought a large number, if not the majority, of Srila Prabhupada's Brahmin-initiated disciples were bogus, in his view. I informed him that everything he had just blasted as being totally and absolutely bogus, that Srila Prabhupada had delegated all of those things to others for years in ISKCON. This devotee was a direct disciple of Srila Prabhupada. And yet he was at first he was in total disbelief because he had no idea that Srila Prabhupada had delegated all those things. So at first he thought I didn't know what I was talking about. And he was insisting that I was totally wrong. But then other devotees assured him that what I had said was true, that Srila Prabhupada had delegated all those functions. Eventually, this devotee had no choice but to concede that he was wrong about this. But he also found it surprising that Srila Prabhupada had done such things, and yet His Divine Grace had not given any explanation as to how and why it was valid and bona fide for him to delegate these aspects. All we find is that Srila Prabhupada gave the instruction to do a certain function and explained how to do it. And that was it. Srila Prabhupada had instructed Bhagavan to chant the Gayatri Mantra to the new initiates and to give Sri Govinda Das the thread on his behalf. He gave no other explanation. He didn't quote any verse from scripture stating that the Guru can delegate to another disciple to give the thread to a new initiate. He didn't explain how and by what precedence it was bona fide for him to delegate the chanting of the Gayatri Mantra into the ear of the new initiate by another disciple on his behalf. He gave no explanation why what he was asking his disciples to do was bona fide. However, I did actually find one letter written to Purushottam Das in October of 1973, where Srila Prabhupada does give a reason for having one of the GBC chant on the beads rather than himself performing this function. So yes, Srila Prabhupada did give an explanation. He gave a reason, at least in this one case, for why he was delegating this part of the initiation process to one of his disciples rather than he doing it himself. On the screen is the excerpt which I will read from. I have chanted on the beads you have sent me, and they are mailed under separate post. But in future, I request you to send the beads for being chanted upon by Madhudvis Swami. This is to avoid the postal charges back and forth. Please see that the new disciples are always engaged in devotional service. This is a letter to Purushottama written on the 23rd of October in 1973. The reason Srila Prabhupada gave here for having a nearby GBC chant on the beads rather than sending the beads to where Srila Prabhupada was when he was further away wound up being a very interesting reason. Srila Prabhupada said he was delegating this aspect of the initiation process in order to avoid the cost of postage. This was the only time I found any explanation given by Srila Prabhupada at all for having delegated all these different aspects of the initiation process. And it was a rather simple and practical reason to just save postage fee in this instance. I wouldn't think that was the only reason, because obviously Prabhupada had so many different GBCs chanting on the Gayatris, and that wasn't the only reason. That just happened to have been one reason that Srila Prabhupada had cited there. Jayadvaita Maharaj was arguing that Srila Prabhupada would have had to have given a months and months long dissertation to all of his senior men as to how what he was doing was fully bona fide. Yet when Srila Prabhupada did one time give any sort of explanation at all, it wound up being a very practical one. Srila Prabhupada didn't even address the issue of whether or how it was bona fide for him to delegate such functions of the initiation process. This would indicate that Srila Prabhupada didn't consider the material aspects of the initiation process as being of utmost vital importance, that only he, the initiator guru, must perform directly and in person or be personally involved. No, the mundane physical aspects of the formal physical process of the initiation is not what makes the initiation spiritually potent. It is not what makes the process bona fide. The physical aspects are not what the real initiation is about. Whether Srila Prabhupada chanted on the beads directly himself, or whether he chanted on the Gayatri Mantra, chanted the Gayatri Mantra in your ear directly, or whether he performed the fire yajna directly, or he personally selects your name, or he decides who is qualified or not, or whether he delegates some or all of these physical aspects of the initiation process for others to perform on his behalf, none of this makes any difference as to how bona fide and complete or how potent the spiritual aspects of the initiation was. What the July 9th directive shows us is that Srila Prabhupada could delegate any or all of the physical aspects of the initiation process, and yet the spiritual aspects would remain 100% spiritually potent and bona fide. For years, those who oppose the ongoing Rtvik system have argued, because there was no past precedence, then Srila Prabhupada could not have started an ongoing Rtvik representative system of initiations. I have heard this argument made many times, and it annoys me to no end. The argument is that because no past acharya had ever set up an ongoing system of accepting disciples when he is no longer physically present, then Srila Prabhupada could not or would not have ever done so. They argue that Srila Prabhupada would never have done anything that a past acharya had not previously set the precedence for first. Why does that annoy me? Because when we take their argument to its logical conclusion, what they are saying is that Srila Prabhupada was not a real bona fide acharya, that he was not empowered, or that he was so much less advanced than the previous acharyas. They are arguing that if a past acharya had set up a system where they could accept disciples when they were not present, that this would have set a precedence that Srila Prabhupada could have then followed. But because no past acharya had ever set that precedence, they argue Srila Prabhupada couldn't set the precedence himself. Why? Because he wasn't empowered, or he just wasn't as advanced as past acharyas, or that he really wasn't a representative of Krishna, or that he wasn't a real acharya. I mean, just see, what they are saying is that only past acharyas were so advanced and empowered enough to set a new precedence, and that Srila Prabhupada was not. That is why that argument annoys me, because Srila Prabhupada was one of the greatest of all acharyas in our line. Of course, he was authorized by Lord Sri Krishna to set up a system that no past acharya had ever set up before, because there was a current need of such a system. Spiritually potent and bona fide. Therefore, Srila Prabhupada never felt obliged to have to give months and months-long explanations for how and why he can delegate those functions to others and remove himself physically from the process. All he ever did was to instruct, you do this, and gave a short instruction how to do it. And that was it. Aside from all those functions that he had already previously delegated from time to time to other disciples to perform on his behalf, what was additionally different about what he delegated to the Rtvik representatives? The only new additional aspect that he delegated to the Rtvik representatives that he had not delegated to anyone else before in the past, that the nearest Rtvik was to now accept the recommendations given by the temple presidents on his behalf, His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. That is the one and only unique feature of the Rtvik representative system, which His Divine Grace had delegated in His directive on July 9th, that He had never delegated for others to perform on His behalf before then. Just that one last aspect of the process, that rather than the temple presidents sending their letters of recommendation to Him, from now on, they would send them to the nearest Rtvik, and they would accept those recommendations on His behalf. That was the only new thing that was added by this July 9th letter. Adding that one last final step wasn't really a huge big deal when you view it in perspective. It wasn't any more of a substantial step than for the temple presidents to make the original assessment of who was qualified to become a disciple of Srila Prabhupada. It wasn't any more substantial of a step than having someone else chant on the beads or someone else come up with the spiritual name. Then why should Srila Prabhupada, why would he have had to have rounded up the entire GBC and all the senior men and give months and months of lectures and explanations on how and why that last one step was so valid for him to delegate this? All the other aspects he had many times before delegated and never gave any explanation or justification for delegating them. This one last step was of no additional significance. It was no different. All he did was say, you do like this, and then gave instructions on how to do it. The same as he had been doing previously with all the other aspects. As I said, at first Jayadvaita Swami's argument seemed good and reasonable, but once the facts are studied, then the basis of his argument fell apart completely and became conspicuous by its absence. Because Srila Prabhupada is empowered and authorized directly by Lord Sri Krishna, whatever process His Divine Grace Himself authorized is bona fide, the same as if Krishna Himself authorized it. He didn't need to justify each and every step while He was delegating the various mundane aspects of the initiation process, including the final step, which again was of no more significance, that now He was delegating that the Ritviks would receive the letter of recommendation from the temple presidents. In contrast, however, is the lack of instructions that are totally absent regarding how multi-guru masters would have fit in the managerial structure he had established for his ISKCON mission. You see, the difference is with the Ritvik, it wasn't Jayadvaita was saying he needed to explain why he was doing what he was doing. But he gave the instructions on how to do it. But what's missing with the multi-guru system is there are no instructions. That's what's missing. There are no instructions at all on how it was to be done. Also completely missing is even one single mention at all by Srila Prabhupada of a future ISKCON with multiple spiritual masters. Yet for 7 years, he had given so many instructions regarding how the GBC would manage after he departed, and he gave clear instructions in writing how the Ritvik representative of the Acharya system was to function without the need for his physical presence or involvement.